Writing novels is to me a way to actively construct hope. You don't need to have an extreme experience to write something, but I really think you need to get to some extreme of your existence here as a human being. I just find it more intriguing when people have something that is not resolved between them and other people, between them and the world. And I really think that's what we all are looking for as readers. Because if you fit into anything, you don't want to read a book. Masculinity is in trouble somehow, and I'm glad it is.
This is the podcast Dichtung und Wahrheit. My name is Silke Hohmann, and I'm here to talk to authors from Suhrkamp and Insel about their poetry and their truth. Hello. I am delighted to welcome author Paolo Giordano, with whom I will discuss his life and his writing, and of course, his novel Tasmania. Welcome, Paolo.
Thank you. Hi, Silke.
Paolo, you were born in Turin in 1982 and earned a PhD in physics. Your debut novel, The Solitude of Prime Numbers, became an international bestseller. You write screenplays, theater plays, as well as journalistic articles and essays, for example, for Corriere della Sera. You live in Rome and Paris. Your very first book, The Solitude of Prime Numbers, became a huge bestseller. Tasmania was the most read novel in Italy last year. While writing, can you sense that a book can be successful?
Well, you'd better not think about the word success as you're writing a book. You know, success is a very difficult thought to pinpoint, especially when it comes to books. I think you can maybe predict success for things that you put in the market, clothing, maybe even for some movies or things that had to do with some form of entertainment. You can write a very successful song, probably. But when it comes to literature, you know, what you're looking for, what I'm looking for as a writer is really to be on some sort of edge, some sort of border. So you never know what is going to happen on the border and how people out there are going to react to the fact of you being on that border. So I think the thought of success would be very unhealthy and would keep you within the borders, whereas what you want to do when you're writing something new, because you want to write something new, is to get as close to this border of expression and literary ambition that you can get.
That's a beautiful description of a journey to the border that might be sometimes far or sometimes closer, but can you give me a more concrete image of that border?
Well, there are many forms of borders when we're talking about literature, you know. There are stylistic borders. And I think that as readers and as lovers of books, what we really are constantly looking forward to is a form of the novel that is brand new to us. Like, the form is very important. We hardly talk about the form today. When we talk about novels, we mostly talk about themes, characters, and all that. Those more, those easier things to recognize. But novels really still are about the form that the novel takes. And anytime I stumble across a writer who has done something that I feel is brand new, he got to some border, then I'm very happy for all of us. as a reader, as a writer, as a human being. And then there are, existential borders that are the ones that you try to explore when you're writing. They can be very inner, deep desires. They can be fears. They can be actual experiences. You don't need to have an extreme experience to write something, but I really think you need to get to some extreme of your existence here as a human being. So, yeah, the idea of a journey to the border, and the fact that you're observing something there, searching for something, or just finding something. You just find something there, and then you come back and try to bring what you found to people in the form of a novel that is very close to my idea of what this work is about.
Mm-hmm. You're a scientist and an author, and literature and science are two very different spheres with highly distinct approaches to reality. You're at home in both of these fields, and I was asking myself if you try to make sense of the world with two entirely different systems at the same time.
Well, science. We should say probably sciences, pure, because there are so many different approaches to the description of the universe that you can have. And literature and philosophy and psychology, to me, they're all different languages, keys to approach reality from different perspectives. And I have to say that physics was, to me, the most powerful one for many, many years. I still think that the description of the universe that physics can give you, especially theoretical physics, which was the one that I did a PhD in, is a very powerful tool to understand reality. But what happened to me at some point while I was mostly working as a physicist, I was about 25 years old, was that I started to feel I started to miss people in that world. Okay. And that description of the world was lacking people, human beings. And so I kind of instinctively turned to the other thing that was very relevant in my life, which was reading. And that's why I started writing, just to connect again to people. But it's true that the quest that is there, that the search for meaning or for understanding, or the exact opposite of understanding, the way that you look for a mystery at the heart of things, to me is very similar in the two approaches.
Let me try something. Usually science is equated with rational truth, while art and literature are seen as sites of invention that lack proof or counterproof or objective criteria. Would you agree if I reverse this statement and claim that is the art that provides the proof, and that science would be nothing without narration and speculation?
And mystery. Yeah, I mostly agree with your second version, with the opposite version, because, well, that's something that we know it from narrations and movies and books that tell the stories of like very renowned scientists. We know everybody's now talking about Oppenheimer, for instance, but there is something true there, which is the fact that most of the people I met and the people who were very brilliant in science, they didn't get close to science for a need of rationality, but mostly because they felt the attraction of some mysterious, even obscure power that lies at the center of what we know, of the big unknown that is within the very thin layer of the things we know about the universe. And that's also why I think it's so interesting to call science into the arts, because it's such a huge, there's a whole world of simple words that are so fascinating in science, and that as long as you look at them in a poetic way, you turn them into something, some sort of art, they immediately shine.
And from the other end, the arts also can transform science and physics into beautiful things that can reach people.
And we need that. There's also a matter of necessity. I think we all recognized it more clearly in the last years. I mean, the years of the pandemic, in that sense, were a sort of edge that we crossed, because we, as a society that was very strong in Italy, we sort of realized that the scientific knowledge is something that we simply cannot live without anymore. Mm-hmm. If you try to live in this world, to go through this life without any form of scientific understanding, which can happen, especially in the way like Italian school is constructed, that can happen. You can, at some point, you can just forget about math, science, whatever, and forget about it. But science won't forget about you. This is a world that is more and more shaped by scientific knowledge. I mean, this podcast that we're recording now will probably be made into other language by an artificial intelligence. So we're in a world that is transforming very, very fast in that sense. So either you decide to be blind and just walk through it without any real understanding, or we need to find ways of making science more understandable and reachable and just there for people to understand.
Mm-hmm. Reading your texts, I find that you have a great sensitivity towards special characters that are loners or marginalized individuals, people who do not fit in with the masses. For example, in Tasmania, there's a young student who takes his own life. And these are very fragile, even tragic characters. How do you develop such vulnerable personalities? How do you get to know them?
Well, I don't think anybody really fits into the masses. It's an interesting way to put it. And it's probably something that you don't really choose. You just happen there at some point for lack of choices, maybe for lack of opportunities. It's true what you say about the characters that I describe. In my own life, I'm mostly interested in people who have a sort of very peculiar angle, very peculiar, who are not at the center of the Gaussian curve of our personalities, if there is one. I like people who are somehow in some margin of the existence. I also think it's more interesting at the literary level to look at reality from a marginalized perspective. You know, when you look at something and it's just, you look at a shape, at some volume, anything, and you just like throw a very powerful white light on it, it all becomes flat. And any shape becomes more interesting if you put a sort of oblique light into it. And the world is more charming at sunset and at sunrise because the light is so low and it doesn't come in that direct way. So I think that's similar when it comes to people and characters. I just find it more intriguing when people have something that is not resolved between them and other people, between them and the world. And I really think that's what we all are looking for as readers. Because if you fit into anything, you don't want to read a book. You just go out there and live your very well-fitted life.
One of the many crises you identify in Tasmania, from my perspective, was also a crisis of masculinity. For example, there's an aggrieved professor, there's a husband upset by childlessness, there's a cleric who decides to love despite the rules, but he's rejected. And through your characters, you invite readers to deeply reflective thoughts about expectations, about roles, and everything that is connected with that. But rather than presenting your audience with fixed moral insights, you take them by the hand and involve them in the eternal process of your characters and also the obstacles that come with it. What are the major challenges when it comes to masculinity?
Well, masculinity is in trouble somehow, and I'm glad it is, in a way. You know, there is a big history of feminism. Women had to think a lot more about their place into the world because of their position. They had to reflect more, so that there is a whole history of ideas behind that. Whereas masculinity had the privilege not to reflect too much on its own place in the world. And now there's a moment of quick transformation, not quick enough probably, but quick for the standards of many people. And we have a very young generation that is questioning lots of things. We have a generation that is slightly older than mine, who is often very resisting to this possible transformation, new vision of gender, and whatsoever. Italy is a Catholic country in that sense, so we feel it a lot. And then there's my generation, which is probably in between, that can sort of understand, still very well understand both versions, and somehow has different difficulties in coping with both and finding their place. So my idea with Tasmania, of course, was not to give any definitive perspective on this or answer or whatever. It was just to, as a physicist, I used to study in a field called phenomenology, which was the description of the many particles that are around in the universe. And I thought of Tasmania sort of also as a sort of phenomenology of middle-aged young men, mostly young males, and probably because I've had my own issues with masculinity, as everybody, since the beginning. It's an idea that I mostly hated in my life, the one of masculinity that is more mainstream, let's say. So in the books, not just in Tasmania, but this started, I think, from my first novel, and it went on in different ways. There's always an attempt to, I don't know how to say that, deconstruct it, question it, even tease the ideas that are sometimes behind the very concept of masculinity and whatever it means.
I was wondering, since you describe the human relationship so finely, and on the other hand, you deal with this really big picture, like the whole constellation of the world as it is. What connection do you see between the world's major problems and the human relationships on a small scale?
Well, I feel the big scale problems and the small scale problems are now more deeply connected than they were like only 10 years ago, maybe. I'm not really sure if that's just about me and the fact that I'm getting older. So, and you feel the reality that is outside more. You feel that everything concerns you more than it did when I was like 20 or even 30. But I wouldn't say it's just about me. I would say it's something real and even factual, because there were things that happened, especially here in Europe in the last 10 years, and they came in a row, and they are the things that appear in Tasmania. The years of terrorist attacks, the climate angst becoming a sort of wide mainstream problem, a concern for everybody. Then there were the years of the pandemic. Now we have the Ukraine invasion. All these things, they somehow came very close to our everyday life and personal lives. And I felt they entered sometimes in a very violent moments in our relationships. And it didn't seem to me that clear anymore. I felt there was a gap between myself and the rest of the world, if we want to call it like that. So Tasmania really tries to cope with that idea. How much does the outside world interfere with our personal relationships and the way we talk with our partner in the morning, or the way we are hopeful about our kids or about not having kids at all. And also the other way around. How much do our personal everyday problems, and there are, people in these novels are facing things of life as everybody else, divorces, losses, marriage crisis, whatever. But how much do these personal things influence the way we construct our opinions about the outer world? I think we really need to start questioning this territory, because we often behave as if we were very rational toward the outside world. But everything says to me that we're mostly irrational, and that the two things, sentimental part of our lives and that opinion part about the world, they are linked in ways that are very mysterious.
Can you give me an example?
Well, these last months, all the debate about the Ukrainian invasion was very clear, and sometimes it was very interesting, the fact that many of the people who turned out to be, well, if not really pro-Russian, but let's say not really pro-Ukraine, there was a big overlap between those people and the ones who, in the years of the pandemic, were like very skeptical about vaccines. They even became quite violent about it. So what's the link? The link, to me, can just be found in some sort of problem or frustration or anger that lies within you, and the more personal and mysterious way in which you feel yourself within this society and world, and even in more personal things. But all of these things are then presented as if they were rational, even scientific, or like based on studies. And that's one of the things that happen in Tasmania. It's more fun the way in which it happens in Tasmania. But one of these main characters, at some point, it tries to he expresses a very sexist theory about women in the academic world, and he supports his ideas with data, stating that the truth is based on data, and when you have good data, then you know the truth. But the reality is far from this. You can get to the most fake and made-up truth with the support of data if you manipulate them in the way that you want. So the truth only lies in this relationship towards what is there and the way we interpret it. And I think this really applies to many personal and apparently faraway things of our lives. Sorry, this was difficult to express in English, but I did my best.
No, that was very interesting and definitely worth a second thought. At one point in your book, the protagonist talks to his friend Giulio about a structure of hope. Right now, it seems that we really need some positive mindset to be able to take the necessary action. Can you explain what a structure of hope is?
Well, I'm glad that this made you think of it, because it's a decisive idea that's in the heart of the book. And I may be mistaken about this, but people often distinguish other people between optimistic and pessimistic. And you often can be asked, well, are you an optimist or are you a pessimist? And I never know what to answer. It just sounds to me as the wrong question, as the wrong way to put it. But if I have to answer, then I'm forced to answer that I'm a pessimist. I behave as a pessimist. I write as a pessimist. I instinctively see and acknowledge problems in the reality, and I foresee catastrophes that can come very easily. So there's something in me that is related to the idea of things going bad. And that's also deeply related to the fact that I write in some way that I really don't want to understand completely. But then, well, Giulio and the narrator, who's very similar to me, at some point they consider the world, especially with respect to the climate crisis, and they're talking about the atomic bombs that has a major importance in the novel. And somehow they know the same things. The things that again, the data, the information they start from is more or less the same. They agree on it. But from that point on, somehow their feelings diverge. And that's what a structure of hope is somehow, to me. The idea that there is something about the way we have or not have hope in the future or in something specific that has not really to do with the facts. It just has to do with something that is structural of our personality, and it's way more mysterious than that. And so this book became at some point also a way to compare different structures of hope of these characters. I don't know if I answered to your question. But...
No, totally. Would you say it is possible to enable people to this structure of hope?
I think it's possible to construct forms of hope. And I actually think it's necessary to construct forms of hopes. And I can make a very specific example of it. Writing novels is, to me, a way to actively construct hope. It's a way out of despair. The very fact of being a novelist, the idea of believing that you can write a novel is some sort of opposition to destruction. There is a very interesting small essay of an Italian writer, Elsa Morante, and she wrote this essay about the atomic bombs in the years where the threat looked very near and frightening. And she was not a scientist, so she starts from the bomb, but immediately she gets away with it, and she starts writing about the thing that was really in her life, which was writing and art. And at some moment, she gives this definition of a writer, and she says a writer is someone who opposes themselves to destruction. It's art is the exact opposite of destruction. And I really think this is the case. So and this is just one example, which is what I do, but there are so many ways of constructing hope. And it's slightly different than the more usual idea that hope is something that you just receive. So that means you're optimistic. You're optimistic no matter what is the case. It's just something that you have in yourself or don't have. But I think that's a bit misleading. I like to think more about the ideas of constructing hope.
That's a really important difference, like receiving hope or, actively hoping. We've reached the interlude of our podcast. Now it's time for a short round of quick questions to loosen things up before we delve deeper into the novel Tasmania. Paolo, I'll ask you either or questions and you are invited to respond quickly. Not too serious. Are you ready, Paolo?
I'm ready.
Schrödinger's cat or the space dog Laika?
Schrödinger's cat.
Your characters in Tasmania wonder which of their senses they couldn't do without. Which one is it for you, hearing or sight?
Hearing.
Artificial intelligence, friend or foe?
Foe.
You travel a lot, train or plane?
Train, but I have to admit, lots of planes also.
Rome or Paris?
Oh, that's tough.
That's the answer, huh?
Yeah, that's the answer.
Okay, now it's time to talk about your current book, Tasmania. The first-person narrator, Paolo, is a scientist and author who has somewhat lost his footing after learning that he cannot have children of his own. He and his wife give up their attempts at artificial insemination, and at the end of the chapter, even their marriage is called into question. Simultaneously, the outside world also seems to be falling apart. The book is set in November 2015, just a few weeks after the terrorist attacks in Paris. Paolo travels to the World Climate Conference, where he is shaken by bleak future scenarios, and at the same time, he decides to write a book about the atomic bomb. Together with the famous physicist and cloud researcher Jacopo Novelli, Paolo asks himself which place in the world might still offer a livable future. The scientist's answer is Tasmania. If the world sank into chaos, where would you go? Or maybe I should rephrase the question from an if into a when statement. So when the world sinks into chaos, where do you go? Where is your Tasmania?
Well, the idea itself of Tasmania, an island where we could save ourselves, is, of course, very twisted. It really comes from a scientific or pseudo-scientific article I found. So Tasmania really looks like a good option, but of course it's very small, and it would just be for very wealthy people, few of us. So I guess you and I would not be included, and we have to find our other ways. And if I had to choose geographically, and somehow I did, I did it in a very counterintuitive and even stupid ways, because while I was writing Tasmania, I was renovating an old abandoned house in deep southern Italy, in the southern part of Puglia, which is a very climate sensitive place, that might suffer of lack of water, of extreme heat in the near future. So scientifically, rationally, that wasn't a very good option, but it's a place that I love, and I like to imagine myself finding shelter there. So that's also how that tells the difference, the impossibility of knowing things and acting really consequentially in our present life. And I think that fact of not being too consequential is really the testimony that we're alive and that we're human beings and we just don't use our minds. But the Tasmania we need to look for is probably not a geographical place. It's just, I would say, a sentimental place. And I think that that sort of salvation, that possibility of being safe, really lies in a few human relationships that we can build with some effort.
One of the characters that is, to me, one of the very, I mean, they're all very interesting, but Novelli, because he's so contradictory, he kind of interested me very much. And he's rather vain and very self-confident. He's a star physicist. And he responds to another question by Paolo, that he believes that the catastrophe is already there, more or less, that it's inevitable. And that the sooner you accept that, the better for everyone. However, Novelli also struggles to find a proper answer to why he himself has children. And there is this huge inherent contradiction when it comes to having children today. You have these intelligent, educated men, characters in the book, who know that the future holds many problems, and yet not having biological children plunges one of them into a deep crisis. It's a conflict between facts and innermost humane existence, no? We know that the future is full of threats. However, it doesn't mean that we no longer want children. How can this contradiction be resolved, or even how can we even think both things at the same time?
I don't think it has to be resolved in any ways. It would be very dangerous to resolve it rationally. Somehow having children also in other times was rationally not a very good choice. That's one of the reasons why the book goes back to the nuclear age and to the years that followed the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. During the 50s, during the nuclear race, the threat of the humankind becoming extinct, really in a matter of like 30 minutes, was closer than it feels now. But that was the moment in which most countries in Europe after World War II had a demographic explosion. So people were having children in the moment when the ending seemed right at the door. So, and I don't think that's shocking. I just think that this is beautiful. Having a kid, and one of the problems today, even I think for very young couples, is the feeling that you have to put everything in order in your life before allowing yourself to have a kid, for instance. And that makes it very, very planned, it makes you think a lot about it. And if you start to think too much about it, then it becomes really scary. My story in that sense is very different, for instance. Every trajectory in that sense is common and unique at the same time. I'm the son of a doctor, an obstetrician. So like the idea of this, not the idea, the actual fact of giving birth was part of my life since the very beginning. I was constantly in contact with stories of pregnant women and women having babies and problems connected and everything else. And then for some random reasons, the person I chose to have a family with, somehow this didn't work for us. And this is also the starting point of this book. And so this idea that I had in my mind that felt very natural to me since the very beginning, somehow I had to change it and deal with the sort of loss, which is not really a loss. It's just a suffering without any loss. It's just the end of an idea of the world, and you have to again construct a new hope in the world. Why was I telling all this? Well, because it's so related to this. There's an undeletable irrationality and something that cannot and doesn't have to be controlled in the really important things of life. And I just think this is the beauty of it.
I like very much how you remind us with the atomic bomb, this most dangerous thing we can think of, probably. And in your book, you, without saying it word by word, but you, to me as a reader, it was like, oh yeah, right, we survived this. I mean, of course, it is not over, was big. But it was a very, very tense situation. And so it was a really a positive thing somehow to be reminded of that. And then you remind us now in the podcast that there was an explosion of humanity while having this contradictory thing, and that it is very human to not act rational, which is scary and which is also very beautiful at the same time.
And we're sort of forced to live again in that idea of a world that is endangered. Not the world in itself. We often say the word, but let's say mostly human civilization, because of all the climate change related problems that we now really know about. And so I didn't answer that, but it was an important question. Yes, we already are into a deep climate crisis. That's one step forward we just need to do within ourselves, basically, because the science is quite clear with respect to that. So what does it take? What is this step forward made of? And to me, it's made of words that are used in the climate debate, like adapting. There are so many inner meanings in the word adaptation, because it's not just an adaptation of the infrastructures and energy providers and all those things. There's an adaptation that is asked from ourselves as single people, as human beings. And this adaptation, the hardest thing to adapt is, again, our hope into the future and the way we reshape the idea of our life in 10 years, 20 years in this new framework that is presented to us. So again, I think art has a lot to do about it. Not that it has to construct, but at least it can open up ways of imagination.
Paolo in the book doesn't complain or suffer out loud, but we see him losing a lot of joy and willpower to shape his life. He has a sort of indecisiveness, evasion, passivity, possibly because of this one situation that he has given up on the desire to having children, but perhaps because also that's just how it is when you're around 40 years, no? And quite suddenly, Eugenio, Paolo's partner Lorenza's biological son, appears very en passant in the novel. And as we learn, he has always been there as a part of the relationship, part of the family. But it seems to me that the protagonist only discovers the child very late. What is the significance of this realization?
Well, it really happened like that as I was writing the novel. Tasmania, in writing Tasmania, I decided to have a very random approach, erratic. I wouldn't know how to call it, but there was no specific plan. And I just thought I would let myself be driven by the writing and taken in places I wouldn't imagine. But in my mind at the beginning, there was no Eugenio. The couple that was in the novel had no kids at all, no previous child. They were just looking for their own child. But somehow that was not really true to my actual life, because my wife has 2 kids from a previous marriage, and I've been living with them since they were very small, very young. So there was this truth that somehow didn't want to be denied in the novel. So at some point, exactly as it happens in the novel, quite unexpectedly for me, Eugenio just enters the picture. He's been there, he was there, but he's not exactly the child that the protagonist was struggling to have, just because it's not his own, but he's there and he's real, and their relationship from the outside would be very easily mistaken by a father to son relationship. So what's the difference? And so Tasmania became from that moment a sort of investigation into that. What are the boundaries of a parent to child relationship? Can we strictly define it, or there are relationships that somehow go over those boundaries? And I had the luck to stumble into relationships like that in my life, and actually they were way more surprising and even heartbreaking than anything I could imagine.
That's really nice to hear, and I also enjoyed reading it the way you constructed it, like this little surprise, that change of perspective that just comes, and all of a sudden there's a new power, or it's a new situation. Is that maybe the personal place of security, a point of refuge? Does Paolo find a place where he regains control over his life?
Well, it doesn't really change the position in which he was. It just learns to undefine certain things. The definition of relationships especially is so choking sometimes. We often avoid leaving relationships that are there because of definitions that we put on top of them. We're so scared about defining anything in our human interactions. And so what the protagonist experiences is that maybe he can just give up definitions in these specific relationships. If there is no specific word for it, then maybe it doesn't need one. There's him, there's Eugenio, there's all these years that they shared, all these experiences that they shared, joyful moments, difficult moments, and how would you call that in the end? Is it so important to have a name for it?
Yeah, and also there's a relationship from Eugenio towards this other father, or Paolo. So this is also something that is not under control.
Yeah, exactly. Not under control. It's, for some people, I think it's very difficult to keep control on or gain control over situations. And there are other people, myself included, who have the opposite ways. For them, the tough part is to give up control sometimes. But we really need to give up control in order to be able to live.
That's a really beautiful last sentence. We've come to the end of our conversation, but not the end of the podcast. There's one more anecdote that Paolo Giordano will share with us. And you, dear listeners, are invited to guess whether this anecdote is true or fictional. If you think you know which it is, please send us an email at podcast@surkamp.de and let us know truth or fiction. Among the correct answers, we will raffle 3 copies of Paolo Giordano's novel Tasmania. Paolo, you can go ahead.
So this happened about 2 years ago. I was sitting in Rome at a restaurant with a friend in the summer, and I very stupidly put my phone and my wallet on the table, and then a motorbike came by and it stole both from me. The wallet was a relative problem. The phone is a big problem. But in a few days, I could re-establish everything, including all the passwords, all the apps and everything that we now have and that now rule our lives. With one exception, I couldn't find anywhere my Instagram access password, and I couldn't find any way to re-access my account. I'm not really into Instagram, but I was used to having it, so
you don't want to lose it.
Yeah, I didn't want to lose it. So I started this very complicated procedure of being able to access your account again, which was complicated. And at some point, I got to the end of it, but I ended up in an account which wasn't mine. It was of another Paolo Giordano. Paolo Giordano is a very common name in Italy. There are probably hundreds of us there. So I ended up in somebody else's life, which was a very different life from mine. A lot about football and car races and everything. And for some time, I stayed in that life. I even did a couple of posts from there. Nothing happened. Nobody complained. So it felt like I could go back and forth from an existence that was so different from mine.
Fantastic story. Could be a new novel.
Could be.
True or fictional? Send us your answers. And at this point, I'd like to give a quick reminder that we've put together some similar book recommendations to Paolo Giordano's Tasmania in the show notes. Thank you very much for this conversation, Paolo Giordano. It was great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you.
That was it from my side. Most importantly, if you don't want to miss the latest podcasts, subscribe to the general Surkamp newsletter, where all the podcasts are announced and linked. All the best and goodbye. Dichtung und Wahrheit is a podcast by Surkamp and Insel Publishing Houses. The series is produced by Bose Park Productions.